would you consider making the following modification to your John Smith King Lear metaphor? You have John Smith and King Lear. I would like to suggest a third element, and I'd like to call the third element Shakespeare. And in this version, King Lear is still the separate self, but infinite consciousness is not John Smith. Infinite consciousness is Shakespeare, and John Smith is the finite body mind. And the reason I suggest this is because it seems to me that suffering, pure infinite consciousness, is pure being or God, can't suffer because it's inherently peaceful and fulfilled. And King Lear, the separate self, can't suffer because there is no separate self. So it seems to me that the suffering is going on in the element of John Smith or the finite body mind. And I've heard you at times make a distinction between the finite body mind and the separate self. And so that's why I suggest the modification.
Francis, I see exactly what you're getting at. The reason I'm a little reluctant to modify John Smith and King Lear is because in your new analogy, including Shakespeare as representing consciousness, John Smith, the finite mind, King Lear, the separate self, you're making a distinction. John Smith and King Lear are obviously the same person, the finite mind and the ego. But you're making a distinction between John Smith / King Lear and Shakespeare. In other words, you're making a distinction between the ego / finite mind and infinite consciousness. And the whole point of this metaphor, of course, the metaphor is limited, but the whole point, the main purpose of this analogy is to show that infinite consciousness is the same consciousness that we, these apparently finite consciousnesses, are. And that's why John Smith represents infinite consciousness and King Lear represents the finite mind. So you see, in this analogy, I'm going to stick with my analogy, but let me refine it for you, because you've made a very good point. You're trying to distinguish three elements: infinite consciousness, the finite mind, and the ego. And you're right to do so, because the ego and the finite mind are not synonymous. So let me stick with John Smith and King Lear, but let me explain, using just these two characters, the relationship between infinite consciousness, the finite mind, and the ego. So infinite consciousness is John Smith. He lives alone, he's peaceful and happy. He goes to the theatre, he puts on the character King Lear. So for John Smith, that is a series of thoughts and feelings, and a series of thoughts and feelings and a costume. So King Lear is not necessarily the ego. King Lear is the finite mind. It is a limitation of John Smith, which enables John Smith to play his part in the drama. The ego would be the belief that John Smith is King Lear. It's quite possible for John Smith to play King Lear without forgetting himself as John Smith. That would be the infinite consciousness simply playing the part of the finite mind, but without believing that it is that finite mind. So the finite mind is just the faculty of thinking and perceiving. There is no separate self implied in that faculty, and therefore no suffering implied simply by virtue of the fact that we think and perceive. Suffering begins, or the separate self or the ego begins, when we believe that we are this cluster of thoughts and feelings called the finite mind.
In other words, you've said before, it's mistaking the activity for a separate entity.
That's right, exactly. So as long as John Smith feels that King Lear is simply his activity, something he does from time to time during the play, then he doesn't suffer. But as soon as John Smith believes and feels, I am King Lear, King Lear then becomes something he is, not something he does. And then his suffering starts. He forgets that he is John Smith. He seems to become a temporary finite self or ego, and his suffering begins then. So yes, you're absolutely right.
So when you have said many times, you make reference to there's no person, but you do make reference to Shakespeare, Baliani, Rumi, yourself, Francis Lucille, all kinds of people. But you're not saying that those persons, for lack of a better word, don't exist. They do exist as an activity of consciousness,
Exactly.
but not as separate entities.
Shakespeare, Baliani, Rumi, Meister Eckhart, Ramana Maharshi, these are all they're all King Lears, but very refined King Lears.
Got it. Got it.
Yes. So there are no real independently existing people called Baliani or Shakespeare or Meister Eckhart or Francis King or Rupert Spira. These are all King Lear, different characters that John Smith plays simultaneously, whose characters are more or less transparent to their reality, namely John Smith, infinite consciousness.
I'm getting there, Rupert. Thank you.
You are. You're just keep going, Francis. You're just keep going. You're doing exactly the right thing.
Thanks so much.
Good to see you again. Take care.